So let's try to work on upgrading our cognitive operating system. The primary focus of this video, therefore, will be to present novel integrations whereby I unwind a theory for upgrading the all quadrants, all levels, all lines, all states, all types map. This would be a collaborative effort, and the importance of such upgrades could be remarkable for the future of humanity and our children. And David and Oliver have a lot of insights on how to potentially get the ball rolling on this, in my humble opinion. So I just wish to offer some potential further enhancements for the solutions that they have already laid out.
So let's take a look at Oliver's video and see what he's putting on the table.
Hello, in particular David Long. I was impressed by David's integral map, the new one, showing all aspects of spiral dynamics, AQAL and integral, and he asked for ideas to improve the map, and I have one. In particular, the 4 quadrants. David has said that the quadrants is one of the most difficult parts of integral to understand, and I think this is because the way the diagram is designed confuses the concept. Now, we're all familiar with the quadrants. It's a biaxial grid with individual, collective, interior, exterior. The idea of putting those things in a biaxial grid is confusing because it doesn't visually show the concept in a visual way. You have this idea of interior and exterior and individual and collective, but it's too abstract. They're just made polar opposites of the grid, and you're expected to orientate yourself and remember which aspect is where. And in fact, the way even the different quadrants are referred to, upper left, upper right, lower left, it's quite abstracted from the concept that it's trying to convey. So I have a suggestion for your consideration, which is a different type of diagram. And maybe the best thing to do is just show it to you now. I only have a very rough sketch. Apologies for the video quality, by the way. I am no filmmaker, and I'm just going to show this to you on a piece of paper. So here we go. Well, let's just put this in front of you and see what you think. So, as you can see, it includes all 4 aspects of human experience: the I, the we, the it, and the its. But in this diagram, they're arranged in a more descriptive way. You have the interior aspects actually on the inside, surrounded by the exterior aspects. Everything above the central dividing line is individual, which is identified by being in the narrow part of the triangle from the singular individual, and the collective aspects at the bottom denoted by the fact that they are in the wider part of the triangle. So this diagram is both showing what is interior and what is singular and what is collective. So feel free to pause this and take it in and see what you think. I'm hoping that this is easier to ingest than the existing 4 quadrant map. So have a think, have a look, have a talk, leave your comments.
So Oliver's prism may well be a good foundation stone for which to start building out a working house for a sort of AQAL 2.0 model. But I'm going to present some deep changes to the foundations of this house also. So you can see this diagram here. Here. Okay, it's a very basic schema of what it looks like to me at this point. And I understand that looks off to those people that know AQAL theory. For example, aren't basic systems or matter and vital life already included in the upper right and lower right of the dimension perspectives of the quadrants? So why am I doing something kind of redundant here? Does that make any sense? Well, let's think about this ontologically again. Does it make much sense that we'd go from sort of basic systems or matter and vital life to mind or beings with sort of neuronal cords or above that are able to be impulsive or reactive for themselves, back to matter, where brains and things like matter are there again? And I think that's not exactly right, or maybe better put, there's a better way of framing it. So at this point in time. So, okay, well, you may know, something like panpsychism or something like that, and that could be a response to what I'm saying. Isn't there interiority that goes all the way down? And I think I kind of want to grant you that. But the point that I'm going to make is that that isn't the primary focus of matter. Rather, its focus is sort of as the foundation in a certain respect. Now that sounds weird and almost tautological, but I'll play it up more as I go forward here. So a foundation that is, in that way, pre-I oriented. That's as far as it can reach, is to be that foundation. And so the same goes with vital life. Things like plants are vital and they're responsive, but not aware to themselves that they are responsive. In other words, they don't have that awareness that they're doing what they're doing. And that doesn't really start to come online until we get things like neuronal cords, if that makes sense. So I will simply say on this front, there seems to be structures to the way unfoldment occurs. And a central nexus to this theory is the understanding that the structures have a natural flow or emergence to them. So even though there's this the faintest of an I present in matter, it has not yet been operationalized for itself, and therefore that phenomenon doesn't fully emerge in a comprehensive way until we get in and around something like reptiles. How that pattern of ontology naturally presents itself, therefore, is in a somewhat stepwise fashion. And how that stepwise pattern occurs then cross-correlates with the quadrants themselves. And even beyond that, I shall argue that the states share this correlation too. So we get all of these different components starting to integrate. And the idea is that when they start to slot together, then with the states, the stages, and the quadrants, which are now the quadrants being 6 parts instead of 4, so that we start to get a far more integralized structure as a whole of the integral theory, all kind of mutually supporting the importance of one another, because they each then shine better light on the other components and how they sort of functionally fit together. I will also say that think about the exterior quadrants as what they're doing. They map out how we think about objective, more scientific realities sort of better than they point to particular things as themselves, in themselves. As it seems the 4 quadrants map is pulling double duty for the objects in themselves and the objectifying observance of those objects as themselves. Therefore, and this is an important statement, I call this the Wilberian error, but I say that loosely in that I know that Ken is a remarkable person with an astounding intellect and map, and I honor and respect that map, but I will try to use this platform to expand on that map. But if you have any direct questions on what I'm suggesting here, please let me know, and I do encourage critical feedback too. So now let's move on to a video that I present, and it should clarify that kind of spiel that I just presented there, because it was kind of convoluted and dense. I think this will simplify it in a lot more clarity. Basic systems can also be called matter. Notice it's beige-like, fractally correlating with the stage at a much lesser altitude. Molecules also ought to be included as 1.2 of basic systems. Then with vital systems, we get things like cells. Here, vitality cross-correlates with the purple domain. With each step, a new primary focus starts to open up. Here we go from cells to something like plants, which are most in themselves as vital. Therefore, the 2.2 designates its place as the most plugged in of the vital systems. Then on to something like sponges, which are a peculiar hybrid of the vital world and the animal, suggesting a monumental leap is about to occur. Here I've designated this leap into the power system, which could just as easily be called the I systems. I use power to create in the mind the cross-correlation with the third power system in spiral dynamics. With fish and amphibians, this constant live streaming of an I as a power being may not be fully operationalized. And that doesn't really start to happen potentially until we get into something like dinosaurs, when they started to emerge on the planet, where they were in a sense the representation on this planet as the power beings that are most naturally in and as that, in a certain sense. Then with something like birds, that starts to get left behind. They were for a time the most dominant species on the planet as far as the data seems to suggest, after that asteroid collision that may well have wiped out much of the life on the planet. Well, at the same time, at the later part of this, there was this new phenomenon beginning to emerge of these sensitive beings, the mammal, with a very faint limbic system to begin with, and then complexifying into ever greater modes of sensitivity or emotion. A state of consciousness very much lacking in the reptile brainstem mode of beings. For example, the lion is, this is an example, both fractally power-oriented, but in a greater fractal, kind of limbic, care, and emotional. The same pattern is emerging in each of these beings as they play out the different roles that need to be played out for the natural systems to flow, as they should. When we peek into the end of the mammal world, we're getting beings that are starting to be objectifying or it-making, but still from a place of emotive landscapes as they are without a formative objectifying language. Then we get into spiral dynamics itself, or models like it. Spiral dynamics, therefore, is maintained in this comprehensive theory. The big nuance is that it's now seen within a bigger frame of reference, a bigger container. It's the objectifying container that spiral dynamics is holding. The fractals are the bigger container. We again move from more objectively basic in beige to objectively vital in purple, to objectively power-oriented in red, to objectively caring in blue, to objectively objective in orange, with the system's most in itself, after which it is starting to run out of steam, and the need and desire of the cultural creatives, or the green system, is to punch through the objectifying systems that are now stifling the landscape. And that is why healthy green is so badly needed and cherished. It's relativizing and decentralizing the backbone of the previous systems, where integralization stages can start. So notice I've colored the integralizing systems in green. The reason I did this is I'm suggesting there's a fractal correlation with the green system, which starts again in basic mode in yellow for its planetary or its survival, not the objective survival humans may have encountered when they came to existential awareness of death. Here it's on a vast scale that they're aware of and they created in part. So we're starting to make sense of how the interior and exterior components of beings grow and how that relates to all the other systems. And we start to live stream that awareness in its novelty in coral, but these new powers and awareness of them can tempt us to use this in selfish ways like reptiles may have. So I finish off with a tentative stage pioneered, in my opinion, by a friend, where we come to recognize that the potential chaos of coral needs safeguards in place, and so the natural flow once again brings about something like cosmic policemen to protect against these superpowers. Therefore, the indigo stage. Let's check in again with David on his ideas of the ontological unfoldment of the quadrants as he sees them, and then I'll come back with a brief response to what David said.
Instinctively think about the pros and the cons. You know, once you've internalized a map so much, it just becomes a part of your auto programming almost. So my contribution to integral theory, the Davidian map versus the Wilberian map. Notice the 1, 2, 3, 4 and the 1, 2, 3, 4 in the quadrants here. Now this is talking about ontology and epistemology, or the order in which the world arises through the quadrants, as well as the order in which we perceive reality through the quadrants with epistemology. So the idea in integral theory is that the quadrants tetra arise, meaning all 4 quadrants arise at once. And that's true in sentient holons, or in living beings. All 4 quadrants exist at once in all of our experience. This is true. But in terms of cosmology or ontology, the quadrants don't go all the way down and back. So that means that one quadrant gives rise to the next quadrant and so on. So let's just start to take a look at some of the examples of the ways that the quadrants can be represented. And that will be a good introduction into talking about Oliver's prism. As Oliver mentions,
the quadrants is one of the most difficult parts of integral to understand.
And that's why we're going to get into the nuances of some of this stuff. So in terms of ontology or cosmology, first there was energy, and out of that energy came particles, which came together to form big clumps of stuff on which formed environments and out of which grew life. So that's the emergence of the quadrants in terms of ontology or cosmology. Cosmology is origins, ontology is like, what is it? So it is these things in this order. And then in terms of epistemology, it starts with I think, therefore I am, is what Descartes says is the primary thing that we start by knowing. We know that we exist, but it's really hard to know about the existence of others out there. It starts that we first know our own interiority, then we perceive reality through this relative filter of values and meanings and ideas and concepts. And then we see a reality, a world with things in it, things that we could potentially hold in our hand, but there are all these layers between us and the thing. So there's also the idea of this third-person view, where you're extending this same epistemological map, but you're assuming that the it is a person that has interiors themselves. So this would be like something like a third-person map of reality of the quadrants. And I was just talking with my buddy Chris Emerson, and he was saying that the quadrants arise developmentally in our own awareness. First, starting with the development of an I, and then the understanding of a we relationship, being able to extend compassion to the other, and then the development of thinking about it and science, objectivity, and then the understanding of systems and big picture perspective. So I myself have a lot of questions around these ideas of development. So the idea here is that I comes online at red, the we or care for the other comes online at blue, the it quadrant and rational thinking comes online at orange, and the systems thinking comes online at green, and then all four quadrants come online at an integral stage. I'm not sure this is right. Maybe for some people, in some cases, it's more like the I comes online at red, it stays online at blue, they get in touch with the it quadrant at orange, they get in touch with the lower right or the we space at green, maybe they start to get a hint of the lower right quadrant or systems thinking at early integral stage, and then at the integrally informed stage, all four quadrants come online. To be honest with you, that seems a little bit more accurate because a lot of traditional fundamentalists are upper left quadrant reductionists, saying things like, I believe because I feel it in my heart, and they don't actually listen to other people in the world. I mean, sure, compassion and things like that can come online at those stages too, but I wonder if some people don't really get in touch with caring about others until green. But maybe this is more like ideal development. I think it probably depends on your development. Maybe some people don't get it at all. Maybe if you're raised by atheist parents, you just get the I and the it, and there's not that much capacity for we online.
Okay, thought about this a bit more. Wait, can we fix my voice?
What's going on with this? Thank you. Okay. So, in terms of development, the I is both beige and red. According to spiral dynamics, we touch in with the we at purple, at blue, and at green. And so it's true that we're not fully in touch with the we until green. The it domain comes online at orange, and the its domain comes online at integral and integrally informed second tier stages. So if we're going to think about the development through the quadrants, maybe this is the best way to look at it. Fundamentalists tend to be upper left quadrant reductionists. Rationalists tend to be upper right quadrant reductionists. Postmodernists tend to be lower left quadrant reductionists. Early stage integralists can sometimes be lower right quadrant reductionists. This is why talking about this stuff is really interesting and important, because we're not just talking in a blanket way about the quadrants. We're really getting into the nitty-gritty and exploring the details here, and that's exciting stuff. You rarely, if ever...
So I totally agree with your ontological statement that one quadrant gives rise to another quadrant. One of the central focuses of this video was to sort of elaborate on the ontological arising of these quadrants, or now a six-part system as it's emerged so far, which will add, in my opinion, new dimension perspectives as we march on. So that the very nature of the quadrant model, quote unquote, because this is a six-part model, has an emergent quality to that. So that may well get us over the hurdles that you encountered and brought up in this video. In other words, think back on what I just showed you, and you noted some dimension perspectives seemed at odds with a four-fold system that repeats or is fractal in nature. And I agree, that's sort of why I think we need, as of this time in history, a six-fold system at minimum to start making sense of this. And if you have any questions on why I make this statement, let me know. So now that I've elaborated this component of the theory, I'm just going to jump to one last element, and I would like to jump into altered states of consciousness and how this too seems to cross-correlate with both the six-component model and the stages. So the idea, in a certain sense, is that these states seem to map better with the different dimension perspectives, where the early basic and vital states have much to do with states that sort of arise in, kind of the survival modes, and can and are worked with say, practices like martial arts. And then next we get into the more power-oriented states that people like shamans and other power-oriented people may focus on, which seems to arise after this. And if one therefore can control the impulses sufficiently, we can get into states of luminosity, things like lucid dreams. So notice now that one of the major blockers of a lucid dream is the recognition that you may have, for example, sex with someone in that state. and then you go and do it, and usually the state of grace that you're kind of in that lucid dream state or deep meditation, starts to fall away. Not always, usually, and usually one wakes up from that meditation. So these states would cross-correlate, for example, in this fractal system with things like mammals or blue or the indigo stage. So if the luminosity is followed through with, we begin to empty ourselves into a vast formless awareness, much like a pure rational observer would do in orange. And finally, this integration of the high and the low starts to come together, and with it the latent potentials for a rare state sometimes called non-dualism. And this is that integralization that's taking place in that state that is akin to what the integralized stages are like. So this would reflect the relativization and, again, the integralization of green, and more broadly, that next tier that's emerging. So that is, oh no, I got one more part on Oliver's prism that I forgot to address. So I put interior and exterior on the boundary, and the reason is there's a sort of threshold being crossed here. This is pushing my own edge, this part of it. I'm not saying this part's right, but I'm thinking about maybe the implications of what this might mean, but it's highly, highly speculative, so don't take this part too seriously. The previous stuff maybe more seriously. But the idea here is that we can imagine that the early systems are in a certain sense exterior-oriented, but it hasn't yet made itself aware of the fact that it is. And that doesn't happen until much later, until we get into crossing the threshold from mammals into humans with language, where objectifying through language allows us to understand those exteriors. So if there's a pattern in this too, another deeper pattern, then the seventh tier in a certain sense, when it comes, would be an integralizing focus like the reptiles and mammals, where, so sort of two of each, for matter and vital life, power and controlling those impulses, exteriorization and integralization. Those are, generally speaking, the main systems. I didn't say that perfectly, but if you have any questions about that, let me know. But so the seventh tier, in a certain sense, would be interiorizing focuses like those reptiles and mammals, where there's this sort of two things, which be a component of the dimension perspectives riffed off by the quadrants, which are now 7-dimension perspectives instead of 4. I think this seventh is highly speculative. I'm just anticipating potentials of what it might look like. But of course, this is radically uncharted waters, and I can say very little about it. So with animation or things like this, maybe virtual reality, we could better picture this unfolding process and how each of these components start to integralize together and make better comments, think deeper about pointing out how this structure of the flow of evolution structures itself as it goes, builds off itself and the patterns that repeat as it goes. So I hope that all made some sense. And one last thing that I'd like to say again is that I welcome both positive and critical feedback, because it is through both that we advance and do better in the world. So I'm a little bit better slept. This is an addendum that I'm tagging on to the end of a video that I created yesterday in response to David's fairly sophisticated video on AQAL upgrades. So I wanted to address particular things that David said and make some caveats in relation to the theory that I'm presenting. So I was saying ontology and epistemology, and I use them interchangeably in my model because they actually do functionally fit, but in his they don't. So there's probably some confusion there when I say that. So when he looks at ontology, he goes from it's to it to we to I, matter into vital life. So the basic system, and then vitality. Vitality is maybe a better word because it suggests a sort of kind of interiority, but not an I-centered, not an I-awareness response, but rather a feeling sense almost. And then you get an I sitting on top of that, like an I sense of awareness. And then on top of that, you get a we sense, and then an it sense. But you have to keep in mind, when I say all of this, I'm speaking fractally, because I'm suggesting to a degree, potentially, there's innate in all of these systems a level of higher potentials in present. And I don't know the whole context of that, but I think that makes sense. Somehow there's the ability to transcend ourselves and go to some more sophisticated system, and I don't fully understand that, but it means that there's innate patterns that are potentiated, maybe something along those lines. Hold that in a box with a lot of question marks. I think that part of it. Okay, so that said, then we go on to epistemology, and the epistemology then maps very well onto the ontology. They actually overlap very well, as well as the developmental code. But what David says about it is right, in my opinion, when he talks about the idea that it's development isn't even, and sometimes you get a person that they might be at the blue wave and they don't seem to have a lot of care for others or empathy, which in my opinion is what the model ought to suggest. And there might be a few reasons for that: pathological development, these sorts of things, or the fact that the waves are just very thinly layered in that system for the individual. So they didn't leap the stage, but they're just not putting a lot of focus on it, and then they transition to the next, and that would mean an unbalanced ability to cope and deal with the world, because it is a station that is necessary in the nature of things as complexity works. The heart is an essential part, like in a certain sense I'm using this metaphorical, but the code kind of suggests there's a kinship potentially with the heart in blue, and if you leave it behind, then later in life it's going to come back to haunt you, right? So you can rework it maybe later in time. Maybe at green you get a lot more work done on the heart again that you didn't do in the early system. But remember too that from green, blue might look pretty stern and firm and not very heart-filled. But it's two systems lower and that sort of thing. So there's a lot less ability to do certain kinds of things that green could hold that blue just can't, right? So that's another thing to keep in mind. So I'll leave it at that. Any more questions?